Oh my gosh, hi! We're gonna see each other for the first time ever.
I know.
How fun is that? Hi, nice to meet you. Alexander's been on my show when I was on WBAI like every other week, and we never met in person, so it's really nice to see your actual face.
Yeah, well, I've got I woke up with a little blemish on one of my cheeks, which was just, of course, on the day that after all this time you finally get to see me.
Well, you look fabulous to me. I always wish I could grow a beard from here to here, because then if any blemishes happen from here down.
No, flattery will get you everywhere with me.
Well, I have the flu, if that helps you feel any better. So let me introduce you to the audience that we have here. I'm super psyched. We were just talking about Pete Buttigieg and his his recent appearance on the Colbert Report, on Stephen Colbert last night. He was basically saying, I won. Okay, but you didn't. You tied. So anyway, but somehow we still don't have a clear winner in Iowa. But Bernie and Pete are tied, basically. Considering the Iowa caucuses have historically given candidates the bump in their momentum, we're taking a close look at how Sanders and Buttigieg would lead on important issues. Today we're speaking with Alexander Kaufman, who is here, right here. I'm introducing. About how these candidates would lead on the issue of climate change. Alexander is a reporter at Huff Post writing about climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on a warming planet. Alexander, thanks so much for being with us today.
Happy to be here.
Oh, gosh. All right. So it's looking like it's coming down to Buttigieg and Sanders. I think maybe you can hear by the way I pronounce the one guy's name, whose side I'm personally on. But can you talk about the differences in these candidates' platforms when it comes to climate?
Sure. Bernie Sanders has, by and large, gotten the best ratings of any of the candidates in the field for his climate plan. He put out back in August, I believe, a $16.3 trillion Green New Deal that was very extensive. I mean, just some of the top line things. He is essentially calling for creating a public option for clean electricity, whereby he would basically expand on the model that exists for the Tennessee Valley Authority and have federally backed green utilities across the country that would, eventually become, next to nothing for people as the build out of renewable electricity happened. He calls for some pretty radical things like shutting down existing nuclear power plants while also, shutting down all of the coal and gas-fired plants in the country. He calls for...
How likely is that something that could actually happen without throwing us into like a, without upsetting the society so much so that people would go insane?
I think it's important to look at what he has proposed as a very strong opening gambit in what would ultimately be a legislative fight in the Congress. Expecting that, he's not running to be Emperor Bernie and enact a plan like this by executive fiat. So you could expect that he's saying, this is where I would like to get to, come back to me with other things. I think actually it's a rather promising position to start from, in the sense that you are seeing conservative Democrats and Republicans coalescing behind some of these climate solutions that Bernie and a lot of people on the climate left don't really like or take seriously. Things like carbon capture and sequestration, things like nuclear power, research into new advanced and smaller nuclear reactors. These are things that there's a lot of skepticism of on the left. They are things that are happening. And, I think personally there are some compelling cases for them. And so, if ultimately Bernie was saying, this is where I want to start from, and then the compromises included those things, we'd actually probably be in a pretty good spot. So
that's great. It's kind of unusual to have someone running on like the furthest ideas that they have, instead of running on something that seems, more middle of the road, that would get more voters, where people could really visualize it. It's a different strategy.
It's the strategy the Republicans have been employing to great success over the past decade. So I think that
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah. So those are the mainline things. There are also other things where he talks about using federal procurement to direct a lot of green spending from the federal government to women and minority-owned businesses. He allots $15 billion for worker-owned grocery co-ops.
Yes.
There are a lot of provisions to try to not just address the energy systems, but address food and agriculture in ways that would encourage, local food production, sale, and processing, and break up some of these large food monopolies that have been really, just really awful environmental actors, awful employers, and pretty negative forces in society generally. So that's where he's coming from. Buttigieg has taken a slightly different approach. It's certainly not as comprehensive, but he has chosen to highlight certain things that are in keeping with his message of being, the nice boy from the Midwest, right? He talks a lot about redirecting federal spending to help to rebuild rural communities, which is also part of Bernie's plan, but it is particularly highlighted in Buttigieg's plan. Buttigieg really zeroes in on the need to do different techniques of soil management and sequestration of captured carbon dioxide into soil in ways that he's saying, will create new markets for farmers and will be able to, revitalize some of these communities that have really suffered in rural America. He does call for some really strong renewable energy provisions. He does call for taking a really aggressive role on the world stage in terms of leading on climate diplomatically.
So he's better than Trump, is what you're saying, even if we hate him.
I would say he's better actually than a lot of the candidates in the field. To be completely fair, it is something that he has certainly prioritized. He has not taken the same kind of aggressive and comprehensive approach that Sanders or even Warren to some extent has taken, but he's not a joke when it comes to this. I think I've lost.
Oh, sorry, that's me. That was me. I did that. I turned off my mic so that I could cough and not in your ear or face, and I forgot to turn it back on. But you recently wrote about Trump's basically all-out assault on the environment, and it's only February. Can you talk about some of the things that we are seeing him do? We just talked about how he doesn't give a shit about birds. Yesterday he did something about the bird. Oh God, we just discussed this 5 minutes ago.
So the environment and climate overall is probably one of Trump's most vulnerable Achilles heels in this race. Polling shows that whether you are a conservative Republican or you are a progressive Democrat or you're a goddamn socialist, you are really concerned about climate change and about environmental destruction. And this is something where Trump has been cartoonishly bad on, and proudly so. So this is something that you're seeing Republicans really try to start to pivot around this and say, no, we're no longer climate deniers. Actually, we just want a strong, small government, market-based, insert 3 more catch phrases there, solution to climate change. And so in the midst of this pivot, you're seeing it from even the president himself, where a couple of years ago he was taunting climate scientists at every turn and talking about how, this is a hoax, or, oh, it's a cold day, it would be nice to have some of that global warming, yuck, yuck, yuck. But he now is saying
once a huge hurricane was going right toward Mar-a-Lago, maybe he changed his mind a little bit.
Well, or he wants to get reelected. So he has kind of pivoted around this, where now he's saying, oh, climate change, oh, it's a big deal. And, during his State of the Union speech, he mentioned that he was, joining this 1 trillion tree project and things of that nature.
Oh,
but
yeah.
What's important to know is that while his rhetoric may be changing ever so slightly, in just the past month, he extended the tenure of the head of the Bureau of Land Management, which I think for probably people in this audience, when you see BLM, you think it's Black Lives Matter, but in this case, it's the Bureau of Land Management, which controls all the public land.
They both, they share it, yeah.
And the guy who's in charge of that, William Penley, is an extremely radical guy with very extreme anti-environment views, and who is just absolutely seems to be looking to further privatize or exploit the industrial purposes of some of these pristine protected lands in the United States. So he is loathed by most of the environmental groups. Now he will remain as the acting director of that agency, which is a big concern for people, because they said, oh, well, if you want to keep him, you should nominate him to be the permanent one, and then he should have to undergo the scrutiny of a Senate confirmation hearing. He doesn't have to do that now. At the same time, Trump shortened the NEPA environmental review process to basically make it easier and to slip through new pipeline projects, new highway expansions, and other infrastructure like that. He has completely rolled back the WOTUS rule, the Waters of the U.S. Rule, which expanded federal protections to wetlands and streams that feed into larger bodies of water. Farmers really complained about this because they said now they had to meet extra standards where they couldn't just dump pesticides or other chemicals into water.
You're drinking water? How rude of us to not want farmers to dump pesticides into. Alex, is there a place that farmers could put their old pesticides that, would be kind of a safe area? I mean, I can see that they need to dump them when they're done, but where can they do that would be safe?
Well, there are there are a variety of ways to kind of do this more safely. It's just it takes more work and it can be expensive. And when mistakes are made, the fines under a rule like the one that the Obama administration proposed and Trump kind of fully rolled back last month are costly. So, but I think it's important to note that these have less of an effect on mom and pop farmers with 80 acres and more on these large industrial farms that have a lot of clout and a lot of lobbying power in Washington. So those are the real beneficiaries of a.
So what you're saying here, if I'm understanding you correctly, we only spoke about Sanders and Buttigieg in terms of folks, who are in the Democratic, running for the Democratic nomination, is that any Democrat would be better than Trump when it comes to the environment. And that is worth people, even if they really love Sanders and they really hate, say, whoever the other Biden, if Biden happens to get it, when it comes to the environment, your vote for any Democratic candidate would be very important. Is that accurate?
It would be hard to argue against that point. Yes. I mean, this is just not a priority for the Trump administration, and quite the opposite. Rolling back a lot of these protections is a priority. So yeah, I would say almost anybody would be better than Trump on environmental issues. And it got worse than that last month too. As I think you may have been talking about earlier, he rolled back. He made it legal for when a migratory bird dies in a pool of wastewater from a fracking facility, that fracking company is no longer responsible for it. Now, this is a big problem in oil drilling areas because you get lots of birds that land.
And they think it's a pond and they go down there and then they die.
It used to be illegal and now.
Can't they cover it up?
Well, yes, that's what they have to do. They have to put mesh netting over it. Or
I put stickers on my windows so birds don't crash into them. They can't just put a mesh net. How much is a mesh net going to cost?
Well, you all probably pay more in taxes than some of the large corporations that the Trump administration has provided relief to. So
don't bring that up. I literally was just talking about. My taxes are enormous. They're enormous. Enormous right now. Yes, I just did them, and I am. Yeah. I don't even want to. I can't. I can't talk about it. So we have a whole bunch of people in the stream chat. If anyone wants to launch a question out to Alex, hi, Lady Raincloud. Do it now, and I will ask him what he believes. Weak boson. In fairness, I can believe that Mayo Pete is against global warming because he's so lukewarm about everything. That's very funny. So let me see. Yeah. So if you have questions, please launch them out. Alexander is a reporter at Huff Post writing about climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on a warming planet. Here's a question for you. This is a little personal, and I appreciate you. Going here with me. So we're looking to move. We were looking for a place. That is until I got my tax bill, and now I guess we're not going anywhere. But and people are like, we went out to Long Island because just to look, but I can't live there. So people were trying to sell me something that was right on the coast. And they're like, you just get flood insurance, you'll be fine. You write about life on a warming planet and people dealing with it. It seems to me most people are not taking into consideration global climate change and climate chaos when they make decisions about their lives. Am I wrong?
I think that is absolutely true. There was a great piece on the website Popula last year where the writer went to a bunch of real estate listings on Miami Beach and pretended to be, a wealthy woman shopping for a house and was talking to all the real estate agents, and the real estate agents were like, don't worry about it. They put in pumps last year, and there was just this real general sense of denialism. Now, I should probably say, I grew up on Long Island, and my mom's real estate agent on Long Island.
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
Oh no, I don't mean
I'm sorry.
No. You got personal. I'll get personal now. Okay? This is a thing that most people. My mom is a progressive, environmentalist. And
does she still live there? Because that's not the impression I got.
They do still live there, although up on a hill.
Yeah. So. I looked up, where's the highest land? And of course, it's very expensive there.
Yeah. But, it is, they were really devastated by Sandy. They didn't have water or electricity for weeks. And, that reality is something that I think they don't fully grapple with. Now, my parents don't live on the water, so they are in a slightly less concerning situation, but most people there do. And moreover, Long Island is built, is on a glacial deposit, so it doesn't really have bedrock. So, much like Miami, which is on limestone that will, you just can't, even if you build seawalls around the whole thing, the water will come up from below. This is a reality that most people are not fully grappling with. Not to mention the fact that this place gripped by car culture, where people aren't exactly making a rapid transition to electric vehicles. Not that, your individual consumer choices will make that big of a difference with climate change, but there is a general feeling of inertia, I guess you can say, about, how things have been. And it's hard to see,
we have some questions coming in. I'm a Dad says, what is your opinion on the BlackRock strategy to stop investments in coal and new huge investment in renewables? Do you think this is a signal for all other large funds to invest more in renewables?
I do. And moreover, the stuff with BlackRock and a lot of those really large scale institutional investors is that it makes a big impact, in particular on countries like Brazil, where, the Jair Bolsonaro's presidency has been really...
he's burning down the friggin' forest. This is very bad.
So that, that strategy for a country like Brazil, which is extremely dependent on foreign investment, can actually make a pretty significant impact on the decisions that are made there. So the ramifications of what BlackRock is doing could be quite large. But I always wait to see how these things actually pan out. A lot of these big companies, not necessarily BlackRock, but other investors, made these specific carve outs for coal and other dirty investments back in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was being brokered. And there are quite large loopholes in some of them. So it is worth noting that, while this does create some pressure and it does build momentum toward certain outcomes, it is not necessarily where things ought to be given the magnitude of the crisis that we face.
Some of the people are in the chat are asking about some of the technological solutions that have been proposed to combat climate change. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts about these different ones that you're familiar with, and what are the feasibilities here?
Sure. I am very, personally speaking, I'm a very, to use a term that Republicans like to use, I'm an all of the above strategy type guy. I think that it's an emergency. It's an emergency. And I don't think that this is a time to be dogmatic about any one solution. There is a lot of fear and a lot of skepticism, rightly so, of things like geoengineering, solar geoengineering, whereby you would, spray aerosols into the atmosphere to
Aren't aerosols what we tried to keep out of the atmosphere in order to stop the ozone hole?
So it's without getting too much into the science, there is an argument for doing research into this. It's a very nascent thing, but doing research, if this were something that could, in the short term, lessen the impacts of warming while we did the work to decarbonize, so that there wasn't so much suffering in the meantime. So that's one rather extreme example. A less extreme example that I think is happening and is quite important are things like direct air capture, which is technology that actually sucks CO2 out of the air, and then can be used.
Can we figure out how to get that in all our cars? That would be amazing.
They're finding there's a variety of solutions that are being invented.
Let's run our cars on CO2 and get.
But that's really important, and people, a lot of environmentalists will tell you, oh no, we'll just plant a bunch of trees and that's how we'll get the negative emissions that we need. But I've seen a lot of evidence that suggests that may not be a sufficient solution.
I've always had the idea that we should plow down strip malls, any or all of them, and put trees back. Amazon's delivering your stuff anyway. You don't need to go anywhere. Not that I'm for that. Anyway, other questions are that are coming in. What about, Weak Boson says, what about foreign policy? We often talk about building windmills and eating one less burger a day, but that's all domestic stuff that makes little difference if we're mobilizing our mechanized army to control the global supply of fossil fuels while mercilessly extracting all resources from developing nations with our capitalist imperialism. Thoughts?
I'd say that the WBUI listeners have really followed you on to Act TV, huh? No, so that is 100% right. The whole idea that your individual consumer choices are somehow an important or somehow can be the solution to the crisis that we face is just it is neoliberalism embodied, as if your green consumerism is going to get us out of this, when it isn't. And of course, this is an international problem. The emissions that are ultimately going to come from countries that are developing now, and that frankly, who are we to say that Tanzania doesn't have the right to lift its people out of poverty, or keep people from getting sick because they rely on burning dung inside of huts to cook from, when they could have electric stoves that are powered by some electricity, and ideally renewable electricity. So
does it have to be dung or oil? There's got to be a middle ground between.
Well, I'd say that there's it's not a middle ground, but it's something that goes beyond that, which is that you can ostensibly provide for renewable energy and other things like that. And there have been proposals around that. Some of what Bernie has proposed, what Warren has proposed, and others is the idea of a green Marshall Plan type thing.
Mm-hmm.
The kind of huge federal spending package that we used to rebuild Europe after World War II, that if we were to do that to help a lot of these developing countries to, rapidly scale up their green technology, that would be really helpful. Another very popular idea on the left is that if and when we are to enact a Green New Deal here, and we are able to start manufacturing all of these technologies here in the US, creating all these great jobs in solar panels and direct air capture, you name it, batteries, that instead of putting a strict patent on that and then selling it to these countries, that we offer it to them for free and allow them to replicate it on their own, much in the same way that we did to a country like Brazil with HIV, where we helped to develop HIV treatments and then we gave it away. We didn't say, oh, this is a crisis that the world is facing. We developed it. Now pay our companies, pay our pharmaceutical companies. No, we gave it. So I've heard that comparison a lot to the way that we could deploy green technology in some of these places. And I would also say, just imagine, the world in which, seeing somebody in a uniform with an American flag on it, that person is coming not with a gun and a weapon, but with a shovel, and is helping to do wetlands restoration in certain places, or building.
That is the world I'd like to see.
Like less army, more Army Corps of engineers, and that would be a really. That would be a really powerful career path for people that are here, but I think B, also a really powerful tool for diplomacy in a lot of allied countries.
I was just listening to this, may or may not be relevant, and I have one last question for you, and I do really appreciate you being on our program. I was hearing on another radio program that I listened to, the Tom Hartman show, that there is a group who are working to get legislators to work on this like year of service, and not compulsory, but sort of compulsory. It's not really compulsory in the US, a year of service, but it would be something like really recommended and highly rewarded and highly regarded, and really get people back into being service minded as opposed to being like kill military minded. Have you heard anything about that? It was the first time I'd heard it.
Yeah, so there are a few proposals around this, and to kind of bring this back to where we started, Bernie has really proposed as part of his Green New Deal the replication of the Conservation Corps, the Citizens Conservation Corps that existed under FDR, and which was responsible for planting 6 million trees in the 1930s and 40s. He said we want to do a climate conservation corps, which would be that, rather than the only option if you're a kid from a town where, you can either, go work at Walmart or, twiddle your thumbs, that, instead of joining the army, you could go and do the conservation corps and pick up all these skills around maintaining solar panels or doing wetlands work or, doing other kinds of conservation work. So that's one idea that's very popular. Other candidates have championed it as well. It seems like a layup. And to his credit, this is something that Pete Buttigieg has pushed for as well. Not necessarily specifically focused on climate, but doing a year's worth of service of some kind. And I think that would certainly include climate work as well.
So our final question, and this is kind of a mashup of questions that are coming from the stream chat. I think if you could if I can put this all together, if you could address how we get people who are maybe, I think one of the people I asked, like, how do we get our parents to see that we're that we're not just like brainwashed by science or liberals? How do we get people who are, I guess, in a different generation, I think boomers is what they were calling them on the chat, to really see what an emergency this is? And do you have any evidence that they are is it really political lines that people are not seeing the emergency, or how can we get the question is really, how can we convince people that this is a real problem and we need to get on the shtick?
I actually would.
Oh, one of them says, how do we convince Christians that science is real? Yes, good luck.
Well, I'll push back against the first question, and I'll push back against both actually in a way that I think is constructive.
Please.
I would say that there is actually the idea that there is a large subset of people in denial about climate change is actually quite false, and is what it's the way that conservative media has certainly depicted things. But if you look at polling on this, that it simply doesn't bear out. That there really is a widespread understanding of this. I mean, I was just working on a story the other day and looking at polling in Texas, oil country, and 66% of Texans want fossil fuel companies to pay for the damages of climate change. That really tells you something.
In Texas, imagine if we were in Connecticut.
Not Democrats. So that I think is really significant, and I think people are really pining for some kind of a solution. And so I think arguing over the belief and trying to assign guilt to individual people, assign the guilt to the industries and the people responsible for funding denialism, but trying to respond to go after individual people, I think is not as useful as really pushing specific solutions around things and helping people to envision what an alternate future looks like.
I think that's so important, because I think people, even people who are like, yeah, clearly we have climate change, what does an alternate future look like and how can we get there? Someone was talking a little bit about hopelessness and indifference, maybe. What do you see as you're covering these issues in those areas in terms of hopelessness and painting the picture of how we can we fix this? It seems like we can.
That's a good note to end on. So I'm going to come back to that, but to address the Christian thing as well, I want to point out that it is true that evangelical Christians are, if you look at polling, the most likely to be in the thralls of denialism. There is a reason for that. The fossil fuel industry very specifically targeted evangelical Christians with this kind of stuff. And you are actually seeing now.
They did? Really?
They did in 2006. And you're seeing now a lot of groups within the evangelical community really push back against this and say that things like the Green New Deal are innately rooted in Christian values and taking care of your neighbor, loving thy neighbor, taking care of God's creation.
No wonder they had to go after them and try to.
Well, and so that's what, I just always, and look, I'm telling you this as a Jew from New York. I think it's really important to, rather than paint certain groups with a broad brush, to identify the people in those groups who believe it and who say that those are my people, and try to elevate those voices and really help them to get their message out and legitimize them to a much broader group of people, so that they and the seriousness with which they approach this very real issue, they can kind of amplify that and communicate it to people in the language that an atheist or a Jew or a Hindu who is not part of that community is not going to know how to say in the right way, but people who are of that faith are going to know the right way to code switch and to really connect. And so I think giving power to them and really, giving the megaphone to them and taking them seriously and not, insulting the religion overall and making people in that religion feel like, oh, well, that idea kind of sounds good, but they make fun of Christians or they don't agree with my values. There are people who do. And so I feel like really elevating them is helpful. And so on the hopeful note, if that isn't hopeful enough, there's a lot to feel despair over, obviously. It's a really terrifying situation that we're in, but I think we have never been in a moment where there is a greater grassroots movement to actually make a difference on this and to really not just have an impact on climate change, but have an impact on broader equity in our society and to really change the world by acting on this in a way that's really helpful and thoughtful and humane. And I think that there are so many young people that are leading that movement. There is such a diverse coalition of people leading that movement. And if you're feeling hopeless, I think you should really get on board with them. There's a lot of hope and a lot of energy, and they're looking for more people to help with it. And so I think, it is reckless in this moment to succumb to that despair, because there's real movement happening, and we really don't have the time to sit around.
We're speaking with Alexander Kaufman, reporter at Huff Post, writing about climate change, environmental policy, and the politics of life on a warming planet. It has been a joy to have you here with us today. Thank you so much, and I hope you'll come back.
I will.
Okay. Bye, Alexander. Thanks a lot.
Bye. Thanks for having me.
Bye.